Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our presentation, How Can Large Firms Engage with Entrepreneurship Ecosystems, presented by Stephen Sagi, Professor of Marketing at the Essex Business School. My name is Tanya. I'm on the higher education team here at Ivy Exec, and I will be helping to moderate today's session. But before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping items for our audience. First, all attendees are in listen-only mode. However, we do encourage you to engage in the session by asking questions, which you can do using the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. Please note that we will be having a formal Q&A session during the last 15 minutes, but feel free to send in your questions throughout the session. And additionally, we are recording today's session, so you can look forward to receiving a copy of the recording via email in the coming days. And now I would like to introduce our speaker today. Stephen Sagi is a professor of marketing at Essex Business School and the academic director of the Weekend AMBA program. He teaches, researches, and consults in the areas of customer-centric innovation, disruption, interorganizational relationships, and entrepreneurship. And with that, I would like to hand over this presentation to Stephen.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. Sanya gave the introduction there of who I am. I guess also I'd add to this just briefly how I got involved with maybe innovation and entrepreneurship and the general kind of flavor of what we're doing today. I was a marketing professor. I worked in Istanbul for a long, long time. And I had a colleague who ran a business accelerator. So essentially he would bring in startups and kind of help them grow. And he asked me one day if I would come along and teach these startups some basic marketing. So I went along, got dragged into teaching them marketing, and then ended up working with this business accelerator. And then I ended up getting dragged into working in developing innovation processes for SMEs in Turkey, and then looked at issues of matching startups with larger firms, with SMEs, and with larger firms. And this kind of brought together this notion of, having this engagement between startups and larger firms in the sort of broader innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem. And that's kind of where we are at today. So today I'll just kind of briefly, or first I'll just start by saying briefly kind of 4 things that I'm going to cover. I'll just start by going over what I understand by entrepreneurship, what I understand by innovation, and also what I understand by creativity. The reason I want to do that briefly is just so that we're kind of on the same page when it comes to what we're talking about. Then move into this issue of why there's some research showing how actual firms are engaging, how larger firms are engaging with the ecosystem today. And then from the work that I've done and work that other people have done, how we actually think they should engage with the firms. As Sonia said, there'll be 15 minutes. This presentation will probably last about 45 minutes, and there will be plenty of time, 15 minutes at the end, for you guys for the questions, any questions that come up during the session. So just to kind of maybe set my credentials to start, I just put a poll here, very simple poll. I've been investing in startups for about 10 years now. I think I've been mentoring, investing, some sweat equity, some cash I've put in. I just wanted to ask this question: approximately what percentage of the startups I've invested in, mentored, helped have been successful? A, less than 5%, B, 6 to 20, C, 21 to 50, D, more than 50%.
We're launching the poll now, so please feel free to send in your responses. We'll be closing the poll in a couple of seconds. And here are the results. So 38% of our audience said less than 5%, and then 38% of them as well said 6 to 20%. 9 of them only said 21 to 50%, and 16% of our audience says more than 50%.
Yeah, I mean, the correct answer was the one there, less than 5%. I mean, my credentials are somewhat dodgy. If my credentials are based upon my ability to pick successful startups, I think I'm running at a success rate of about 2% or 3%. which somewhat talks to the randomness of the process, which somewhat talks to the early stage of some of the startups that I get involved in as well. So in 10 years, my hit rate is around about 2%, which is, not great. I wish it was more than 50% or even 6 to 20%, but it's not. It's unfortunately less than 5%. So I'll start just by thinking about what is entrepreneurship. And when I'm talking about entrepreneurship, what am I referring to? And maybe pause here for like 5 seconds so you can think about, what your own definition would be and how it's different from mine. So when I'm talking about entrepreneurship, really what I'm talking about is solving a problem. And as Sonia mentioned here at the start, we have this notion of customer-centric innovation and customer-centric entrepreneurship. And here we have this idea that customers have problems and firms are engaged in solving problems for customers. So entrepreneurship is no different from this. Essentially, entrepreneurs are looking at problems that exist in the market and solving these problems. In fact, one of the biggest criticisms that we see sometimes of Silicon Valley type firms is that they're engaging in, I guess, bro problems, in the sense that there's a lot of 22-year-old to 30-year-old white men in Silicon Valley living away from their parents for the first time. They can't do their washing. There's nobody to take them to the store. There's nobody to make their food. So what do? They invent startups like Uber. They invent startups to bring them food. They invent startups to do their washing for them. Fairly trivial problems. So there's some criticism that is sometimes thrown at Silicon Valley that they're engaging with these problems that don't really matter. I don't think that's necessarily true. But anyway, that's by the by. But really, when we're talking about entrepreneurship, what I'm talking about here is this notion of there's a problem that exists, customers have, and we're trying to, or the entrepreneur is trying to actually solve this problem. So that's what I mean by entrepreneurship. The second thing here is, what is innovation and what is creativity? And again, I'll maybe just pause for a few seconds to give you an idea or give you a chance to think about how you would define innovation, how you would define creativity. Oftentimes we see this. Oftentimes we see innovation and creativity defined as, flashing light bulbs, sparks coming off, people having these wonderful eureka, moments, in the bath, etc. This notion of, ideas, creativity, flashing lights, wonderful things. And I think this is quite a challenging definition for many of us. I think for me, when I look at this, I don't consider myself as the kind of person who has these really bright ideas. So perhaps for that reason, I was attracted to this definition by Schumpeter. Schumpeter's the Austrian economist. And what he talked about was this notion of creativity and innovation being the... So we have, something that exists already, and it's just a matter of changing the combination. And in that sense, we get innovation. In that sense, we get creativity. And we can think of this with regard to clothes. All of us got dressed this morning. We all wore a combination of top, bottom, shoes, socks, etc. So it's a different combination every day, which is an innovative way of getting dressed. I'll show you some examples here. One example, the example in the middle here, the big example there, it says Timmy's Kapak 100% protection. This is from a beer company. It's a Turkish beer company called Efes. And the problem that existed essentially was that Turkish people were somewhat obsessed with dirt, with bacteria, with bugs, etc. And so when you bought a can of Coke, and I'm married to a Turkish woman, so my mother-in-law would, if we'd buy cans of Coke, and my mother-in-law would then take a wet wipe or some sort of soapy device or some sort of soapy tissue or whatever and clean the top of the can. And then you'd open the can and the kind of soapiness, the cleaning fluid, whatever it was, would be flavoring your cola. So what they did was essentially took tinfoil, which exists already, and they stuck it on top of the cans, and then you had this innovation. You also see it for San Pellegrino as well. Something that exists already. We have cans, we have tinfoil, we put them together and we solve the problem. We create an innovation for solving this problem. So it can be something as simple as that, really, when we're talking about these new combinations. Another example, Pepsi going from glass bottles, which are very heavy, very expensive, to cart around. Logistics is very expensive, to plastic. Plastic exists, so plastic exists. You make a plastic bottle and it creates an innovation. It's a creativity in that regard. So really, when we're talking about, or when I'm talking about innovation, and when I'm talking about creativity, I'm really talking about these new combinations. I'm not talking about having this eureka moment, having this wonderful idea. Instead, I'm talking about this new combination. So to sum up there briefly, entrepreneurship, according to me, and you can agree or disagree with this, of course, it's about solving a problem. Innovation and creativity are about making new combinations that will help us to solve problems. And I've also added at the bottom here some of the principles of creativity that we've found over the work that we've done in creativity. So we found that more ideas mean more novelty. At the same time, though, value and novelty are not exactly the same. So you can have really novel ideas about something, new ideas and ways to do things. But if the consumer does not value these ideas, then there's no real value in that for the company either. And also the individuals or groups can be creative. And actually on our EMBA, we spend half a day to a full day working on creativity with the EMBA students to try and show them, first of all, that they can be creative, and at the same time, try to teach them different ways that they can be more creative in what they're doing. And it's with this that I will come on to this, not exactly an exercise. We do this with EMBA students. I do this with undergraduate students. I do this with master's students, and also have done this with my daughter and her friends. The commoner garden paperclip. All of you know the paperclip. You've seen a paperclip. There's nobody, I think, watching who doesn't know what a paperclip is. So what we do is we take the paperclip and we say to people, okay, how many ideas for using the paperclip can you find? And this leads on to my second poll. So my second poll here is, how many ideas did my 11-year-old daughter and her friends come up with for the paperclip? A, less than 10, B, 11 to 15, C, 16 to 20, D, 21 to 30, E, more than 30.
The poll is now launched. Okay, we'll be closing the poll in a couple of seconds. And here are results. So 4% says less than 10. Then 18% of our audience says 11 to 15. 25% says 16 to 20. 18% says 21 to 30. And 36% of our audience says more than 30.
And 36% of the audience would be correct. And I thank you for acknowledging the genius of my daughter and her friends. No, and it's not that at all. I mean, they come up with ideas that are bizarre. An ant swing, I think, was one of the most interesting ones they came up with. They could open it out and you could create a swing and ants could go on the swing, so it would entertain the ants. But you're right. I mean, my 11-year-old daughter, she's not a genius, she's not the most creative, but she can sit down with her friends. I have a video clip of it as well, but I couldn't show the video clip here. I had a video clip of it as well, where they're just coming up with the weirdest, wackiest ideas and just outdoing each other. You know, so 60-second period, they come up with more than 30 ideas. This leads on to poll 3. And poll 3, we do the same, exactly the same task with EMBA students. So what I do is I actually have the video and I show the EMBA students the video of my daughter doing it after the EMBA students have done it. But I do exactly the same task with the EMBA students. And again, poll through the question, how many ideas does the average EMBA student come up with? Less than 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, 16 to 20, more than 20.
We're launching the poll. Oh, we're seeing some very interesting results so far. Okay, and here it is. So 18% of our audience says less than 5, 54% 6 to 10, and then 21% says 11 to 15, only 6% says 16 to 20, and only 1% of the audience says more than 20.
So I think the audience recognizes the problem. I mean, the actual answer is 11 to 15 is for the average EMBA students, but you know, you get the point. I mean, 54% if you said 6 to 10. Again, we do realize that the average kind of 38-year-old EMBA student who's been through, you know, 12 years K-12 education, has been through university, has worked in a company for 10, 15, 20 years, and is unable, they've been formatted in such a way that they cannot come up with as many ideas as 11-year-old or 10-year-old children can do. So I think you get the idea here. I mean, we see this quite clearly. I've run this, you know, with I think maybe 10, 15 different classes. It's not, you know, and it's something that comes up over and over again, that we see, you know, 40-year-old people working in companies are just not capable of coming up with the same number of ideas and being as creative as young children are able to be. So, you know, this then gets to this idea of, you know, why is an 11-year-old child and her friend able to get more novel ideas, more ideas than high-performing EMBA students? And again, we've mentioned this, you know, we format people, we frame people, we put them into this box. They're frightened to make mistakes. There's loads and loads of different things that come into the reason. And there's loads of research that's been done on this, on how can organizations actually allow people to be more creative? How can organizations allow people to flourish? So the notion of creating a supportive climate, particularly from the leader down, you know, supporting people to be creative, allowing them to be creative, encouraging them to be creative. Also allowing people to talk in organizations. I've worked, a lot of my career was worked in Istanbul, in Turkey. A lot of my career has been in France as well. And both of these countries have quite solid hierarchies that make it very difficult for people in organizations, particularly lower down in an organization, to actually have a voice within the organization. Issues of knowledge sharing, issues of cooperative norms. The fifth point is very, very important, having incentives that will encourage people to be creative. We want to be rewarded for being creative. We don't just want to be punished for making mistakes. This notion of tolerating failure but not incompetence, encouraging experiments, and also having performance management that aligns with the above. I mean, many companies that I would go into, they would have this desire to have their people working for them being creative, but they wouldn't have the systems in place and the processes in place that would allow this to actually occur in the organization. How do we develop these organizations? We want more curiosity. We want people to be curious. We want people to have the ability to engage in curiosity within the organization. We need to hire curious people. We need to encourage people to actually look at problems from first principles and actually think about how to solve problems from first principles. Allow employees to explore, allow employees to have learning goals, allow employees to fail. But of course, these are easier said than done. We also see in organizations that there is a lack of agility in the organization. Organizations move very, very slowly. There is a lack of toleration for failure. We also see examples where people have been punished for failure. Well, if you punish me for making a mistake, if you punish me for failing, then I won't take that risk again going forward. So I won't take that risk. It can cost me my job. So I will not take the risk. I will not try to be creative. I will not try to solve a specific problem in a more creative way. Loads of bureaucracy that exists. Organizations are very slow. We're also seeing today, the seventh point there, this notion of best people are going to startups. We're also seeing today, you know, top MBA programs, 30 to 40% of their graduates are going to work in startups rather than going to work in large organizations. So even the best employees are no longer going to these large firms. Another point, KPI misalignment. I worked with a white goods manufacturer for a long time in Turkey. And one of the biggest problems they had great ideas, they had wonderful ideas, they'd work with startups, they'd have startup projects, they'd do investments in startups, but their KPIs were not aligned so that the startup would be allowed to flourish. So you had this misalignment that occurred, and as such, it wasn't successful, and all the kind of the plans they had kind of came to nothing because of this misalignment of the KPIs. Another problem that exists is this notion of the ambidextrous organization. So by ambidexterity, we're really referring to the ability to use both hands, the ability to write with your left hand and with your right hand at the same time. There's a guy, Jim Marsh, who was an organizational theorist, I guess, at Stanford, and he came up with this notion of the ambidextrous organization. And here what they're talking about is that organizations have two things to do. On the one hand, you have to exploit your existing businesses because that's your bread and butter, that's what makes money for you. But at the same time, you have to be able to explore and find new sources of revenue for your company, so engage in innovation at the same time. One of the biggest problems, of course, is that the skills and competencies required to exploit your present business model and to continue to receive revenues from your present business are very different from the skills and competencies required to develop innovation and engage in innovation and develop new products, etc. So one of the tensions there was how to create an organization that allowed you both to explore and to exploit. Again, I can give the example from the white goods manufacturer I worked with. They were a large OEM also for TVs and other electronic goods. And the owner of the company decided he wanted to develop a brand at the same time. The problem was that the competencies required for OEM, which was, meeting specs at the lowest price possible, at lowest cost possible, were very, very different from the competencies required to actually develop a brand as he then wanted to do. So you found this tension that existed in the organization. They were very, very difficult. They found it very difficult culturally as an organization to move from only doing OEM to doing OEM and engaging and developing their own brand at the same time. So the second problem you have is this ability. Not all firms are able to be ambidextrous. Firms find it very difficult to actually exploit and explore at the same time. The third problem here is also this notion that startups are coming. So this is just a picture of the European fintech landscape, if you will. And you can see the hundreds of different startups that have been funded by VC in the fintech space. And you notice most of them are not trying to be banks. I mean, most of them are just taking a little bit of something that a bank does, and it's almost like, death of a thousand cuts. One company will take this piece of business, one company will take this piece of business, one startup will take this piece of business. But we're seeing startups able to compete with large corporate companies in a way that they were never able to compete before. So we're also seeing that firms have the threat of startups. Startups have access to the best talent. They have access to the resources they never had before. VC money is flowing in at the same time. So startups are able to compete with larger companies. So larger companies are now thinking, oh my God, what do we do to actually engage with these startups and deal with these startups? These are the problems, but at the same time, there are also benefits. There was a report written by the World Economic Forum in 2018, specifically referring to Europe and how Europe can make itself a player in innovation. America is obvious, VC, China is also somewhat obvious, but Europe was stuck in the middle somewhere and unsure as to what model to follow. And the World Economic Forum, they wrote a report in 2018, and they essentially argued that Europe's competitive advantage could be in finding a way for startups and larger firms to engage together. So startups technology selling to large companies or whatever, but engaging in what they call the fourth industrial revolution that would allow for this sustainable entrepreneurship ecosystem, the sustainable innovation ecosystem in the long term. They laid out the various benefits for each party, and you see here for startups, customers, first of all, to have corporates as your customer. One of the biggest complaints of startups in Turkey was always this issue of, well, we want corporates to be our customers. Corporates come, they sponsor events, they do this, they do that, they do the next thing, but we really want them to buy from us. So, if corporates and startups are engaging together, then we will see a situation where corporates are buying from startups, where startups are able to sell through a corporate channel, where startups have access to seasoned professionals from the corporate that can help them, that can mentor them, and that can really benefit them and help them as a company and help them in their career. For the corporates, it gives them access to very innovative companies, very innovative suppliers. It also gets them access to startups that are very close to the customer, so allows them to really focus on the customer. It also allows them to see what's happening. The big issue of disruption, everyone's talking about disruption. Clay Christensen started talking in the 90s about startups disrupting corporates. Well, if corporates are working with startups, then they will get to see the disruption before it happens and perhaps prevent the disruption actually happening. So it's not just that there are problems that corporates can't be creative or that corporates are being attacked by startups. There's also clear benefits for both corporates and startups of corporates and startups working together. So these are all the reasons why I believe, at least, and also the World Economic Forum also believes that large firms, SMEs and larger firms should really look out towards the entrepreneurship ecosystem, the innovation ecosystem as a potential resource for them to use. Now, I guess the question here is, what do we mean when we're saying entrepreneurial ecosystem? What exactly am I referring to? And it's all the parties that go into being the ecosystem. So venture capital, and here's just a graph showing US venture capital investment. So venture capital is part of the ecosystem. Here's another graph showing venture capital invested in different countries. As you can see, 52% of all venture capital, sorry, not 52%, 52 billion of it is all in the US. So the majority of venture capital is in the US. Europe, very small amount, China, slightly bigger, but the lion's share is in the US. So venture capitalists are part of it. Startups are also part of it. Here we see a graph of startups around the world. Universities, they're also part of it. You see here's the top 13 universities in the world from the Quacquarelli-Symonds World University Rankings. So we see MIT at the top, we see Stanford, we see Harvard, we see Cambridge from the UK, Caltech, Oxford, ETH, Zurich. These are all, not only the faculty are involved in producing technology that can be used for startups, at the same time, they're producing some of the best students. Students are, they have business accelerators. Students are creating startups and get into the business accelerators in these universities. So these are also all part of what we call the ecosystem. Here's another graph showing where startups have been founded. Again, of what's going on. China is there, Europe, London, particularly for fintech, East Coast of America, and also Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Jose, West Coast of America as well. Also large global companies. We see the change here, substantial change here from 2008, where you had more traditional companies, the largest companies. Today, or this is 2018, it's Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook. And again, many of these are American companies. We also see Chinese companies moving in here, Tencent, Alibaba, etc. So when we're talking about the ecosystem, we're talking about venture capital, we're talking about startups, we're talking about universities, and we're also talking about the government. We're talking about governments putting policies in place that encourage innovation. And we can see here the World Economic Forum Global Competitive Index just showing the top 25 most innovative countries. This is where policies are in place that encourage innovation. And we always hear the EU here talking about, how can we encourage innovation? We talked, Macron, when he became president of France, was also talking about, how can we get more startups to come to France? So all of these things make up this entrepreneurship ecosystem. Specifically, when we look at Europe, we see a kind of mixed bag of a flourishing ecosystem that is potentially being held back to some degree by some cultural and some path dependencies that exist historically. So we do see some of the best universities in the world, places like Munich Tech, places like, in Zurich, the University in Zurich, whose name I can't remember, INSEAD, ESSEC, HEC for Business, Cambridge, Oxford. Some of the best universities are in Europe, not the very best in the world perhaps, but some of the top 10 universities are in Europe. 10% of VC money, big companies, not the biggest. Only 11% of unicorns being billion-dollar private companies. So we see some movement, we see some action that's happening in Europe vis-a-vis the entrepreneurial ecosystem. At the same time, we also see the EU, we also see things like GDPR, we also see the EU fining Microsoft back in 2006. We also see EU threatening Facebook. We also see the EU fining Google. We also see the EU talking today. I just read something in the FT this morning where the EU was talking about, these tech monopolies that exist and how do we break up tech monopolies. And in some ways, the EU is seeing large tech companies as a threat rather than a potential partner for all of these things. Margaret Vestager as well. She is the EU Vice President for Digital. Here she was nominated in 2019. Now she is the EU Vice President for Digital. And she's the one that's been responsible for hitting these large tech companies, for hitting Google, for hitting Facebook with large pennies as well. So there's a kind of balance between, encouraging innovation, encouraging entrepreneurship, really wanting entrepreneurs to come to Europe, set up their firms in Europe, and at the same time, the EU and its more protective nature towards things like data, privacy and other issues as well. So it's a kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of relationship that's occurring in Europe. And it always leads us to this question. This is a castle, Saint-Germain-en-Laye, where Louis XIV was born. It's also where I live, not in the castle, just in the town. I wish I lived in the castle, but I live in the town. And this question about, is Europe designed to be a historical park, and what is the European ecosystem? What is Europe's place in the ecosystem vis-a-vis innovation? So with that, I guess the next question is really, or twofold. There's 2 questions here. How do large firms interact with the ecosystem today? And the bigger question and the research that we do is, how should large firms interact with the entrepreneurship or innovation ecosystem? And I'll first start with, how traditionally have firms engaged with the startup ecosystem. This is a nice graph here. It comes from Weeblin and Chesbrough, a paper they did in the Californian Management Review. And essentially they were able to break it down into 4 pieces. So you had what they called outside-in innovation. So it would come from the outside and come into the corporate, and also inside-out innovation, which would come from inside the corporate and go out. And they'd also split it into equity involvement or no equity involvement. So here they have a typology with 4 different types: corporate venturing, startup program, corporate incubation, and startup program with a platform. So I'll just briefly go over these 4. So corporate venturing would be where the corporate has a venture capital wing, where they will take equity stakes in startups. They'll make a small number of investments. They'll have a VC group, which is actually reporting to the board, and it's not necessarily part of the core business they're doing. There's various examples I've put here, some of them global, some of them from France. Google Ventures, SNCF, LVMH, as there's BNP Paribas, etc. So this is where they have a separate corporate venture capital wing, and they're investing in the startups as they choose to do. There are some challenges here as well. I mean, there's one example that I was working in a little bit quite closely with, where because of carry and everything else, and because of the way incentives were set up, the VC, some of the people on the VC arm of the company were earning more money than the CEO of the company. So this obviously created some cultural problems that existed in the organization, and essentially the VC part was closed down in that organization. So there are some challenges with this. We also have what's called a startup program outside in. So this is where you'll see corporates who are perhaps sponsoring programs that will allow themselves to be linked to startups. Generally don't take equity, they just get access to the startup ecosystem, the entrepreneurship ecosystem. They'll perhaps work with various startups. There's a model here, Techstars in Paris, where Techstars will bring in 8 to 10 startups to a batch, and they will then match with a particular corporate. The corporate pays money to sponsor the program, and they then work with the startup. They don't actually engage, they don't actually take equity in the startup, but they just work with the startup, and I think it's a 3-month program. So this allows the firm to actually engage with startups that are working in a similar area to what the firm is working in, and it gives them insight to what the latest cutting edge technology is. And it's also quite nice for the startup as well to have mentors and to have people working with them from the corporate with a lot of experience, etc. 3 examples here from Paris. BNP has one of these, Techstars Paris, and also Station F has a very similar model. Also have corporate incubation, which goes from the inside to out. And this is where you would have, where the corporate would have a business accelerator or a business incubator within the organization itself. They'd allow their best people or their people to actually set up companies within the organization. Alcatel-Lucent had an example of this, where they allowed their best employee, or any employee actually, to come along on a Saturday morning and work in their accelerator. One of the problems that occurred with Alcatel-Lucent, which is now Nokia, was that what would happen is when they got to a stage where the company had reached a stage where it was going to spin off, if Alcatel-Lucent was not interested in investing further in the company would end up leaving and just kind of spin off as an independent company. The problem then being that Alcatel was almost incentivizing its best employees to leave the company. So they had real struggles with how to, on the one hand, they wanted to incentivize employees to be creative and to engage and to kind of create startups, etc. But at the same time, they didn't want to encourage their best employees to leave the company. So that's corporate incubation. And you also have these startup programs, platforms, where, you know, think of PayPal or SAP or Microsoft or Apple or Android, where they have on their platform, and they will take a usage fee from the startup for using it. So these are the 4 typologies that were discovered. Recently, some work has been done by a guy called Benoit Decreton. And what's interesting is that he saw on LinkedIn, I don't even know this guy, but he saw on LinkedIn that I was doing this masterclass, and he sent me an email and said, oh, by the way, we're doing this research in Silicon Valley looking at what's called innovation outposts. And he sent me the paper that's under review. I think it's under review for the California Management Review. He actually sent me the paper and said, you know, if any of this is useful for you, please use it. What I found interesting was that they've actually looked at these innovation outposts where, you know, corporates will open up a kind of an office, if you will, in Silicon Valley. They also do it in China, they'll also do it in London, they'll also do it wherever there are startups. The problem has been that they've not been very, very successful. And what they've done, Benoit and his colleagues have done, they've actually created a typology of different reasons why they're successful, or they've not been successful. And he calls them loners, connected castaways, and VIP sightseers. Loners essentially are companies where the office has been set up and there's no real connection with the startup scene, and there's no real connection with the corporate headquarters. You have connected castaways, they've almost gone native, if you will. They've become really part of the Silicon Valley scene. They've become really, embedded with the startups, but they've lost all contact with the corporate headquarters, which is also a problem. And then they called VIP sightseers at the end, which are, the office is really, really closely connected with corporate headquarters, but has little or no connection with the ecosystem. So they've also come up with various suggestions, and I've added some of their suggestions to the suggestions that we've made based on the work that we have of, how should firms engage with the ecosystem, and I'll move on to that now. So from the work that we've done, and from the work that Benoit's done, and from the work that other people have done, we've seen so many different problems, and we've then tried to think about, okay, we have these problems of how firms are engaging and how it's not being successful. But the question then for us is, how do we make firms successful, and how do we help firms actually engage better with the ecosystem? The first one here is very, very important. Firms must know exactly what they're trying to get from it and what they're trying, the reason why they're actually doing this. The number of firms I've worked with who have a notion that there are startups out there, there's an entrepreneurial ecosystem out there, there's innovation happening out there, and they're missing out. There's a kind of FOMO, there's a fear of missing out. Other companies are working with the ecosystem, so they should work with the ecosystem as well. And my first question will always be to them, well, why do you want to do this? You really need to, if you want to benefit from this, you need to understand what is the purpose of what you are doing. What principles do you have, and why are you actually engaging with the ecosystem? Second of all, and somewhat linked, I think all of these are kind of linked, is this has to be aligned with your overall corporate strategy. It has to fit in with the strategy of the organization you have. It should be part of the corporate strategy. Underneath the corporate strategy should be an innovation strategy, and part of your innovation strategy should be linking yourself with this ecosystem and engaging with this ecosystem. The third thing, which I think Benoit and his colleagues talked about a little, was having the proper processes in place and having the proper structure in place. So you know what you want to do, it's part of your overall strategy of what you do, and the question then is about, what is the execution? How can we execute, and how can we have a process that allows us to reach this purpose that we have? The fourth point, and this is kind of annoys me the most, and I think most corporates that engage with the ecosystem are engaged in what I've politely referred to here as innovation theater. If I get really annoyed, I will call it innovation pornography. It's really just where they're just doing it for the sake of doing it. They want to be seen as a company that's involved with the innovation system. They want to like not wear a suit and kind of like dress in flip-flops and shorts and go to exciting startup conferences and meet really exciting and cool people and be seen with, all these exciting, cool startup people. But they're not actually doing it for a reason. They're not engaging properly. They're just doing it because it's part of the show. And it makes the CEO happy. It makes like loads of 50-year-old people really kind of happy because they're getting to meet loads of exciting people. It's horrible. It's not beneficial for the company. It's not beneficial for startups. It takes up a lot of startups' time, and it just doesn't achieve anything. Fifth point, I think really important, Benoit mentioned this as well, really, buy stuff from suppliers. If you want to support the ecosystem, if you want to engage with the ecosystem, then use the startups as your suppliers. Trust them, use them as your suppliers. The next point as well is this cultural difference issue. Startups are very different. Startups are fast, they're quick, they're exciting, they're sexy. There's people, they're engineers, they're engaged in really cutting edge technology, and they don't have all the constraints that a corporate has. So these differences in culture, these differences in corporate culture between the startup culture and the culture of the corporate, they're clear differences, and it's really incumbent upon particularly the corporate to think about how to overcome them and think about how to bridge the gap between these cultural differences. Oftentimes you're dealing with young kids, 24-year-old, 25-year-old kids, barely out of college, wet behind the ears, and they just have different sensitivities. They just have a different notion of what is appropriate and what isn't. And I think it's really incumbent upon the corporate partner to actually engage these cultural differences and try and overcome these cultural differences. Aligning KPIs is very, very important. I mentioned this already. If you want employees to take risk, if you want employees to engage with startups, you have to incentivize them properly to engage with startups. You cannot then evaluate them on traditional metrics that you would use. How do you get young employees engaged? One of the biggest problems that corporates have been complaining about for a while now, as I mentioned before, is keeping their best employees. I did some work with Unilever when we were in Turkey, and the manager, she's a mid-manager, she was about maybe 40 years of age, and she said, when I joined Unilever, I felt privileged that I joined Unilever. So I would never have thought of leaving Unilever because I was lucky to actually be there in the first place. She said, though, today we're employing 24-year-old, 25-year-old people, and they have zero loyalty. Their attitude is very much, what can Unilever do for me? So it's not about, they don't feel lucky they're working for Unilever. They think that Unilever is lucky to have them as employees. So one of the things we tried to do with Unilever in Istanbul, and I don't know how successful we were, was try to find ways of engaging young employees and getting them involved. And one of the things we did there was actually have young employees leading the interaction with the startups. Now, this is somewhat risky because then you run the risk of young employees jumping ship, going to work with the startups, finding it more interesting. But it is really key to get these young employees engaged, to get these young employees involved, and they're of a similar age, similar culture, similar background to many of the people who are working in the startups as well. That said, the next point is also important. There needs to be senior level key executive buy-in as well. There need to be champions within the organization itself who are powerful, and you can actually, ensure that this is part of the DNA or becomes part of the DNA of the corporate company. And the last point, I think this is really important, especially now in COVID times. It's very, very, very tempting for firms to ditch all of this kind of innovation, startup, corporate innovation type stuff, entrepreneurial stuff when it's recession, because they want to cut back. The reality is that we see, particularly with innovations, that launching products during recessions is a good idea, and they're far more successful than products that are launched the rest of the year round. And also, it sends a bad message to employees, which is kind of like, okay, engage in innovation, do the innovation in the good times, but the minute anything bad happens, the first thing we're going to cut is innovation and these engagements with the ecosystem. So it kind of sends a message to employees that it's not that important, that it's not a priority, when in actual fact, maybe it should be the priority for the company. That's kind of where I want to leave it. I think I timed it quite well. That's 43 minutes. I had my phone timing. So if anybody has any questions, or I guess Sonia has the questions that people have there.
Yes, we've seen quite a few questions come in from our audience, and I think it would be best if we just dive right into the Q&A session.
Sure.
And thank you, Stephen, so much for this great content you've shared with us today.
Can I also add something very quickly? That if anybody wants to contact me on LinkedIn or email me, if you can provide that information will be provided, I guess, after the session to kind of contact me. That people feel free to contact me.
Sure, we'll be sharing your contact details when we share the webinar recording, of course.
Great.
So yes, we have our first question from Ian, who asked if you could speak a bit more of the kinds of KPI misalignment and give us some examples, maybe. Okay,
so I can, thanks, Ian. So I can give examples from a couple of companies that I worked with. So I was working very closely. I have a friend actually who's working in the company, he works in the finance department. And what they were doing is they were quite ahead of their time. This is probably 6 or 7 years ago, quite ahead of their time, and they were investing in sort of internal startups. It wasn't really a startup, it was kind of innovative project, they call it, but they would have startup groups, 3 or 4 people coming together, and they'd have innovative projects they'd have in this organization. The problem they had was that I don't know how to put this exactly. For a normal project within the organization that wasn't part of this special innovative project group, if you will. It could, let's say, for 2 quarters they could lose money, and then the 3rd quarter the project would be kind of cancelled. The problem with innovation, the problem with startups is, and you may have seen this if you've ever seen the graphs, is they're expected to lose money. I mean, startups and innovative projects to begin with are expected to lose money. So you need more than, you know, 2 quarters to break even. So the KPI misalignment was that they continued with the kind of project KPI of, you know, if you reach the 3rd quarter and you are not profitable yet or not breaking even yet, then we have to kill the project. So the guy that I was working with, Korai, his name was, who was working in finance, was aware of this fact, but his boss also, I mean, he had KPIs, and if he had not kind of cancelled the projects, his boss would then not have given him his bonus. So you had this misalignment where different types of projects required different, you know, performance indicators in that regard. The problem, though, was that subsequently they tried to change and have different, you know, performance indicators for the innovative projects and different performance indicators for bog standard projects, if you will. Then you had this kind of cultural, you had jealousy in the organization, you had huge political problems in the organization, because people were saying, well, hold on, you know, Bob's project has been, you know, running at a loss for 18 months now and it's still going on, whereas my project is. So they didn't explain very well why, and they weren't able to kind of manage the cultural and the political component of sorting this problem. But that was the problem, where they reduced standard KPIs to evaluate these innovation projects, which perhaps required a longer time to come to fruition. Give me one example.
Thank you so much, Stephen. So we have another question from David, who would like to know how startups can protect their value creation when cooperating with large companies.
I mean, I think this is one of the big reluctances that startups have, which is that they fear that when they, I mean, many people start working in startups because they don't want to work in corporate. I mean, that's part of the reason why a lot of kids today start working in startups. So given that's the case, when people like me come along and say, well, you know, you guys really should work together with corporates, they're immediately suspicious of the motivations of the corporate. And also you see large companies and you see companies like Facebook, and Facebook's not a startup, Facebook is a corporate now, you know, swallowing up startups and killing them because they have their own technology they want to bring forward. So yeah, I mean, it's very, very difficult. And I think there's a lot of due diligence required on both sides. You know, it's important for startups to look at the reputation of the corporates, to see who they've worked with before, startups they've worked with before, and get as much information. Are these really startup friendly corporates or not? And if they aren't startup friendly corporates, then stay away from them as much as possible, because yes, the potential is that with the SOPs and with the culture and with everything else, that these corporates, even with the best intentions, can really crush startups and the value of startups.
Yeah. Thank you. And while talking about startups, we have Asher here, who would like to get your advice on the best sources to get knowledge about startups, and a related question. So any advice to solo entrepreneurs or consultants on how to onboard corporate projects and not just animating creativity shops?
Okay, so I mean, I can answer maybe the second question. I think, well, okay, the first question is startups. I mean, I don't know. There are thousands of them. I mean, there's various registrars of startups that are out there. I mean, depending on which country you're in. I mean, some of the best places to look often are some of the business accelerators like Y Combinator, 500 Startups. These kind of business accelerators that are actually dealing with kind of the elite startups and some of the better startups that are out there. Go to universities. Universities will have business accelerators. You know, in my experience as well, if people come along to the accelerator, come along to the university, come along to various kind of hackathons that are taking place, go to any sort of you know, places where Entrepreneur Station F in Paris, then people are willing to talk to you, and you can get information from them there. What was the second part of the question again?
So what would be your advice for related to solo entrepreneurs and consultants on how to onboard corporate projects?
Okay. With corporate projects, I mean, I don't know how the best way to do it, and it probably depends on a different cultural context. The way I've done it is I've gotten involved with usually governmental organizations. So the Exporters Association of Turkey was running these large projects, EU-granted project it was, to develop innovation processes for SMEs. So I just got myself involved with the Exporters Association, and then ended up working with 2 or 3 corporate clients out of that. And then, I mean, I think with a lot of these, offering your services, making yourself useful, valuable, writing, blogging, there's loads of different ways to do it. I've chosen to go through these large governmental organizations because it does provide, it means I don't have to bother about selling things. And also with the university, I've done it through the university. We have a lot of corporate partners at the university. So, I will, our graduates are running companies all over France. So, I use their graduates as well.
Yeah.
But I think it is more difficult. But yeah, large government organizations, the EU runs various projects like this in different countries.
That makes sense. Thank you. So we have another question. So one of our attendees would like to know, how should the firms analyze the risk of willingly and proactively using startups in their ecosystem of growing entrepreneurship in their employees? And wouldn't it be too much of a risk of increasing some unnecessary hustles?
Yeah, I mean, this is the big issue, and I think there is the risk. I mean, if I understand the question correctly, I mean, this is the thing with Alcatel-Lucent, where they had this situation where they were incentivizing their best employees to leave. The problem is, particularly with younger employees today, like I said from the example of Unilever, they don't feel that, they feel it's almost as if they're doing you a favor by working for your organization, and they want to make you work for their loyalty rather than providing you their loyalty to begin with. So, I mean, it's almost like a training question as well. I mean, there's no sort of statement that, what happens if I train you and my employee leaves? Well, what happens if I don't train you and the employee stays? I mean, there's a little bit of that too. I mean, if the employee's going to leave, they're going to leave anyway, I think. And today, there is so much money available, and there are so many resources available for people to start companies. And it's not even just venture capital. There's grants thrown around. There's, people do side hustles anyway, whether the company allows them to or not, and revenues will allow them to do this. There are so many opportunities for people to start their own company. They're going to do it anyway. So as an organization, yeah, there is a risk, and I think you have to accept some degree of, some percentage of employees will leave. But at the same time, if you don't do it, they're probably going to leave anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, and we just have a couple of more minutes, so we have enough time for 2 or 3 more questions. And how important would you say is networking to reach out to the entrepreneurial ecosystem for, like I said, larger companies?
I think, I mean, I think on an individual level, networking is very important. We know where the startups are. It's obvious where they are. I think that for large companies, for me as an individual, it's important to network. But I think for large companies, it's not as important because we know where the startups are, and we know where to reach them. The question is, we don't want to waste the startups' time. I think it comes back to this issue of, why do you want to engage with the startups? You really need to think about this win-win. What do we want from the startup, and what does the startup get from us? What can we provide to the startup, and what can the startup provide to us? And I think if people start with that attitude, that's more important than networking. You can go to the startups and talk to them and engage with them, and they're willing to engage with you, in my experience anyway. And it's really important to really understand what you can provide to them and what they can provide to you. I think that's the most important thing.
Mm. Yes, thank you. And we just have enough time for just one more question. So William would like to know, what is your assessment of established firms' success in engaging well with startup cultures, and internal and external?
Yeah, I mean, it's not even a mixed bag. I think, you know, the evidence that we see is that firms know they should do this, but we still don't know how they should do it. And I think part of the problem is that it's, you know, it's a cliche, but you're only as strong as your weakest link. So if one thing is off in the whole relationship, then it can really mess everything up. So large corporate companies, I think in the past have had the attitude that we're the big guy, we're the tough guy, you know, and there's an arrogance there, there's a kind of hierarchical arrogance that exists there. And selfish and a little bit of, you know, like I said before, they don't want to work in corporates, that's why they're in startups, and they don't see the need to work in corporates. So I think that it's really been unsuccessful so far, for various reasons, mostly because I think neither party really understood what they wanted from the relationship with each other, and there's a lack of trust that existed. That said, I do think that, you know, with careful thought planning from both sides, it's something that can be done successfully. I'm an optimist.
Thank you. That's always good to be an optimist. And thank you, Stephen. And with this, we're going to close our Q&A session. And if you'd like, please feel free to share any final words for our audience.
No, I mean, I think, you know, I tried to kind of put into 45 minutes what we do in about 7 sessions with EMBA students of about 6 hours each. So it's been somewhat condensed in that regard. I do think it's important. I think the issue of how the relationship's been managed between startups and corporates is really, really important. Also governments as well. I think there's a third party we didn't mention, which is government and the public sector as well. There's a lot of work to be done in how to develop this relationship, but I do think that we can see fruitful relationships moving forward between corporates and SMEs and startups in the future going forward.
Yeah.
Well, and if anybody wants to contact me, please do.
Yes, we will share your contact details, Stephen. No worries. And thank you again for this amazing presentation. And it was really a great pleasure having you with us today. And we would also like to thank our audience for joining us. Stay safe, everyone. We hope to see you in our future webinars. Thank you so much.